The idea of ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by creating a democratic, independent Palestinian state seems far less utopian today than when it was first pronounced by President Bush in late 2001. At that time, democracy in the Arab world seemed like a lost cause.
Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm George Gillum. Elliott Abrams is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and teaches at Georgetown University. Following his graduation from Harvard College, he earned a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics and then a law degree from Harvard. After a stint in private practice, he began working for members of Congress. He started with the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Then he worked for Senator Scoop Jackson's brief presidential campaign, and for 2 years he was special counsel and then chief of staff for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York. Abrams began working at the executive branch end of Pennsylvania Avenue in 1981 when he joined the Reagan Administration. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and later as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. In 2001, he joined the George W. Bush administration as a senior director of the National Security Council, and in the second term of the Bush 43 administration, he was named Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy. Please welcome Elliott Abrams.
Thank you, George. Thank you all for being here today. The title today, which has the word peace process in quotes, suggests some skepticism about the so-called peace process, and I am skeptical, but I'm also hopeful. The idea of ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by creating a democratic, independent Palestinian state seems far less utopian today than when it was first pronounced by President Bush in late 2001. At that time, democracy in the Arab world seemed like a lost cause. In any event, it seemed so to most pundits and to most academic specialists and to most State Department officials. When President Bush said he didn't believe in Arab exceptionalism, that is, he didn't believe that freedom could come to every corner of the world except the Arab states, that was seen as naivete on his part, or it was seen as something worse, as a kind of neocon ideology, overcoming facts and experience. And when he said that this demand for democracy would apply as well to any new Palestinian state, this was seen as a devious formula for endless delay. Bush's view led him to a very different attitude toward Palestinian statehood than the Clinton administration had had. The Clinton approach had fundamentally ignored what would be inside the Palestinian state and concentrated instead on setting its borders. Remember where things stood when George W. Bush became president. It's just over 10 years ago now. The Camp David talks had just failed totally. Arafat had rejected first the Israeli proposals from Ehud Barak, and then he rejected the American bridging proposals that were called the Clinton parameters, choosing really war instead of peace. And then came the Intifada, which is to say terrorism against Israeli civilians. And it got worse and worse. Buses being blown up, discotheques, restaurants, cafes, finally a Passover Seder at a hotel, on and on it went. And Arafat was deeply and personally complicit in this violence, something that for years the US government had had tendency to overlook or wish away or excuse. Finally, in June 2002, Bush had had enough, and he gave a speech, June 24th, 2002, in which he said there would be a new policy. Quote, "Peace requires a new and different Palestinian leadership so that a Palestinian state can be born. I call on the Palestinian people to elect new leaders, leaders not compromised by terror. I call upon them to build a practicing democracy based on tolerance and liberty. And when the Palestinian people have new leaders, new institutions, and new security arrangements with their neighbors, the United States of America will support the creation of a Palestinian state." Well, how do we get there? Bush's answer was this: a Palestinian state will never be created by terror. It will be built through reform. And reform must be more than cosmetic change or a veiled attempt to preserve the status quo. True reform will require entirely new political and economic institutions based on democracy, market economics, and action against terrorism. Now, in that speech, he said, I think, two important things. First, the United States now believed in the creation of a Palestinian state. That was new. When I worked for George Shultz in the State Department in the Reagan Administration, it was the explicit policy of the United States not to have a Palestinian state. Jordan should get back the West Bank, Egypt, Gaza, no Palestinian state. So that was the first thing that Bush said. And the second was he was finished with Arafat. The United States would deal with Arafat no longer. This was rather a big deal because Arafat was at that point still quite a hero in the Third World and even in much of Europe. And Bush was widely denounced. This speech, people said, made peace impossible. It was a very great change in the treatment of Arafat when you remember that the world leader who was invited to the White House most often during the Clinton years was Yasser Arafat, 13 times. But Bush was right. What he had realized, and now in June 2002 stated clearly, was that these twin goals of Palestinian self-rule and Israeli security could not be achieved by negotiating with a terrorist. Rather, a Palestinian state had to be built in reality on the ground first. And when it was, and not before, a Palestinian state could formally be recognized. Bush rejected the approach that said democracy in the Arab world is just plain impossible. In a speech in November 2003, he laid out this question. It's an interesting question thinking of the Arab revolts of the last few weeks. Are the peoples of the Middle East somehow beyond the reach of liberty? Are millions of men and women and children condemned by history and culture to live in despotism? Are they alone never to know freedom and never even to have a choice in the matter? That was the question he asked, and he gave an answer in that 2003 speech. It was the right moment for that speech. It was the 20th anniversary of the National Endowment for Democracy, which had been established by Ronald Reagan precisely to support the expansion of freedom. Bush's answer was this. It's a famous quote, which I'm sure you've read in the last month or two. 60 years of Western nations excusing and accommodating the lack of freedom in the Middle East did nothing to make us safe, because in the long run, stability cannot be purchased at the expense of liberty. As long as the Middle East remains a place where freedom does not flourish, it will remain a place of stagnation, resentment, and violence ready for export. This applies as well to Palestine. Given the security concerns of Israel and our own concerns about the dangers an undemocratic, or worse yet, a Hamas-controlled Palestinian state might present to Israel and to Jordan, we cannot first create that state and then hope for the best. This tells us, I think, that the path to peace and a negotiated settlement is bottom-up. It is not top-down. The path to Middle East peace and Israeli and Jordanian security is through building Palestinian institutions, institutions that fight terror and stop terror instead of saluting it, that arrest and jail terrorists instead of glorifying them, that teach students about coexistence rather than hatred, that serve the people instead of, frankly, stealing their money, and support a real economy instead of living on foreign aid. Those are the real preconditions for peace. And far from being impossible, in fact, the Palestinians have made a serious start in all those areas. The great error that Israel and the United States have made, and that our own government, I think, continues to make today, is to think that these essential conditions will be achieved at a conference table at Oslo or Camp David or Annapolis. They won't be. This has been a bipartisan mistake. The Bush administration made it at the end with its focus on Annapolis, I think. And the Obama administration has been making it at the beginning, in their first 2 years, thinking that everything can be resolved at a negotiating table. It can't. Building institutions is still the central way forward, and there is progress. The Palestinian Authority, or PA, under Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, has been fighting corruption and seeking, for example, to building a reliable police force that can bring law and order and fight terror. Fayyad said in reviewing the failures of really 20 years of negotiations, Fayyad said this: "Why not change the discourse? We have decided to be proactive, to expedite the end of the occupation by working very hard to build positive facts on the ground, consistent with having our state emerge as a fact that cannot be ignored. This is our agenda, and we want to pursue it doggedly. It's empowering even to think that way." Close quote. Now, that's Salam Fayyad. What's Fayyad doing when he talks of it being, it is empowering even to think that way? Let me give you two more short quotes. First, what we want is to make it possible for our unfortunate people to live a life of industry, for it is by steady work alone that we hope for our physical and moral rehabilitation. For this reason, above all, we've undertaken to rally our people around our ideal. That's the first quote. Second quote, our progress is laborious, yes, and full of affliction. And if the final victory takes its time in coming to us, we shall at least be able to point to a moral gain growing out of the material need of our people. We shall have shown that our people is still capable of an idealism which defies danger, endures privation, and possesses the infinite patience through which great ends are achieved. The latter two quotes are not Salam Fayyad. They are Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism. And the point is this: like the founders of the Jewish state, Palestinians need to build. They need to build from the ground up. A Palestinian state has to be built by patriotic Palestinians, not received as a gift from foreigners. Palestinians need to stop blaming others, in this case mostly the Israelis, or expecting their deliverance from others, in this case mostly us. Instead, they need to do their work. They've clearly started, and that's what gives hope. There's plenty of reason to worry. There's been a century-long struggle now between Palestinian moderates and Palestinian extremists, and it is not over. And for all the work the Palestinian Authority is doing, it controls only half of the Palestinian territories. Obviously, Hamas controls Gaza. Moreover, if the PA has been reformed, and I think it has, the Fatah party has not been, and may yet lose to Hamas in elections. So that struggle continues. But the Bush administration was exactly right in concluding that a Palestinian state had to be built, and built by Palestinians, not conceded or created by a kind of magic wand. It's interesting to note that once the United States made all of that clear, Israeli politics changed. Ariel Sharon, who was then prime minister and head of the Likud party, announced his acceptance of Palestinian statehood. The idea of a greater Israel, which is to say holding on to all of the West Bank, was politically dead. And indeed, Sharon even withdrew from Gaza and 4 small settlements in the West Bank. He was able to do this when the United States made clear our understanding that Palestinian statehood depended not on what Israel would give away at a conference table, but what Palestinians first built in their own territory. That was, I think, what the Bush administration got right. And we acted on it by helping build or rebuild the Palestinian Authority. What we What we got wrong, I think, was that we then nearly forgot that very lesson and concentrated instead toward the end on conference tables and negotiations. We lost the focus on building institutions. Most of 2008, we focused on the Annapolis Conference and what came after it. We also made, I think, the same mistake the Clinton administration did by saying that we were looking for results according to the American political calendar. For Clinton, it was the end of 2000. For Bush, it was the end of 2008, rather than according to the realities of the Middle East. Sadly, the record of the Obama administration so far shows that they appear to seek to replicate what the Bush administration got wrong instead of what the Bush administration got right. Instead of emphasizing reality on the ground, there's been a gigantic push to recommence Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that I think are not really going to go anywhere. We've seen 2 years of blaming Israeli settlements as the true obstacle to peace. My fear is that this policy runs the risk of blowing a real opportunity for progress now under a PA leadership that is set on serious, pragmatic, real-world preparations for Palestinian statehood. Now, in November, a few months ago, the administration gave up on the settlements freeze obsession, as I would call it. Now, what's the policy today? I don't know. How does the administration plan to move forward now? I can't answer that question either. Your guess is really as good as mine. I do note that George Mitchell has not appeared in public for several months. His staff continues, I think, to pay far too little attention to the critical task of building Palestinian state institutions, and too much time, I would say, dreaming of handshakes on the White House lawn. The cost of that policy is too high. I would argue that it is time to concentrate fully on what can be done in the real world now to make the lives of Palestinians better, to make Israeli-Palestinian cooperation better, and to lay the foundations for peace in the future. I don't think that Palestinians and Israelis are going to live together in peace, but I think they could live apart in peace. Meanwhile, the notion of Arab democracy has changed in this last couple of months before our eyes from a bizarre Bush slogan to a growing reality. Bush actually had a better grasp of reality in the Arab world, as those quotes I repeated earlier show, than most academic experts. I would say the error we made was not that we adopted the Bush freedom agenda, but that we didn't push it even harder. For Bush's basic point, the fundamental point that Arabs are not beyond the reach of liberty has been proved right. And his view that the only way to fight Islamic extremism was through freedom, not through repression, was also right. I mean, we see this in Egypt, 30 years of Mubarak and dictatorship, for example, have left Egypt's moderate parties weak and the Muslim Brotherhood strong. The antidote to extremism is not repression, it's freedom. It's for that reason that I remain optimistic about the revolts we're seeing now in the Arab world. No doubt there will be plenty of difficulty. There will be setbacks. There will be violence on the road to democracy. There has been an explosion of expectations, and many of them will not be met. In Egypt, for example, with a population of 80 million people, there may well be expectations about economic progress that simply won't come as fast as people want. But I think there will not be a return to the notion that democracy is alien to the Arab world. There will not be a return to the view that dictatorships are to be expected and tolerated as natural in the Arab world. I think we'll see a great debate about Islam and democracy. And I think that debate will challenge the Muslim Brotherhood and challenge the Ayatollahs in Iran, and will challenge extremist and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, as they have never been intellectually and doctrinally challenged before. Once again, the center of Muslim intellectual life is going to be the Arab world. And we will be the spectators to these debates of historical significance for them, for the wider Muslim world, and therefore, of course, for us. I hope that a democratic Palestinian state will take its place in a far more democratic Arab Middle East. And I believe we can help that happen if we adjure diplomatic magic wands and try to help in the hard work of building a democratic Palestinian society and government. As I've said, I think much progress has been made. And this approach seems to me the fastest and best and surest path forward toward the outcome that Palestinians and Israelis alike now agree is the right one for both societies. Thank you very much.
Let me open with this. There are some who have characterized the Bush 43 style of leadership in the Middle East as full of swagger. Either you're for us or against us. And that was criticized as being ineffective and of making enemies of people who should have been friends. On the other hand, President Obama has adopted a much more, some would use the word humble, some would use the word diffident, some would use the word indecisive style in the Middle East. I wonder if you could comment on the style of these presidents and what you think are the stronger and what you think are the weaker points of each style.
First, on the question of President Bush, I think the accusations about swagger, it's partly a matter of personal style, but I think it's largely 9/11. That is, we were at a moment in which the country had been attacked, 3,000 Americans had been killed, and the president thought it was important to reassert that far from being cowed by this attack, we were going to strike back. President Obama, I think, had the view, had a theory, let's say, and the theory was that people like the Syrians, the Iranians in the Middle East, but you could say the Russians and Chinese also, had been offended by the Bush approach. And if we took a more humble approach, we'd get more out of them. And I think we've had a 2-year test, and I think the theory has failed. We have not gotten any cooperation out of the Iranians. In fact, I saw a news story this past week about the appearance of more Iranian heavy weaponry in Afghanistan sent there to kill Americans and other troops. We've certainly gotten nothing, I'd say, from the Russians. I don't know what we've gotten from the Chinese, got nothing from the Syrians. So it seems to me there's an empirical test here of whether, in fact, those governments were offended by Bush's style and could, through the adoption of a different style, be persuaded to give us more. It's a theory, maybe worth trying, but I would say it failed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abrams. Would you please comment on your view of the fundamental viability of a bifurcated Palestinian state between Gaza and the West Bank?
I think it is possible to begin that way. I think it is possible with Hamas in control of Gaza to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank without that territory as part of it in reality. I mean, legally you could say it is part of it, though the government would have no control. As we try to think of how Gaza would come back to being part of the larger Palestinian state, I think that also has to be bottom up. That is, I think if you create in the West Bank a prosperous democratic state, you have free elections, you have a growing economy, so that people in Gaza can say, hey, that's what we want. We want to be part of that. We do not want to be in a small statelet whose economy is declining with each passing year and which is run as if it were part of Iran or Saudi Arabia. That's the best way of putting pressure on Hamas, I think, from inside, from the bottom up, so that ultimately they rejoin. I would not delay the creation of a Palestinian state if things are otherwise ready because of the Hamas control of Gaza.
Following up on that same thing, we've tried free elections, and we saw part of what happened with that. And we've also, from what I know, I've been working in Israeli affairs in various volunteer organizations my whole life. And we've been working to build up infrastructure and haven't seen a whole lot of results, as you're pointing out. So I'm curious about what kinds of programs or things you're talking about having us do that would give us a different kind of result.
Well, I would say there was progress in the West Bank. If you look at let's take one date, 1967, the Israelis take over. And life in the West Bank actually improved because, after all, it had not been a democracy, been a Jordanian-run place, no democracy. If you look at the years of Israeli control, two things happen. One, there's an explosion of civic organizations, of NGOs, of every kind, Bar Association, Doctors Association, civic of every kind. And there's also, because in those years, there's no violence, so Israelis and Palestinians are going back and forth daily, shopping, working, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians working in Israel. This is the first Palestinian exposure to a genuine democracy with free elections, with a free press, and they like it. This grows until the day that Arafat returns. And he just slams it closed, and you can track the number, for example, of NGOs, which begin to decline as soon as Arafat and the boys are back from Tunis, because that is not what he wanted. He wanted to be in charge, and he ran the place like what has been a standard Middle Eastern Arab dictatorship. So Arafat dies in November 2004, and in January 2005, there is an actual presidential election. So the creation of this new opportunity of new institutions begins January 2005. It's only 6 years. And I think they've made a lot of progress. It's not 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. It doesn't go back to 1967. It's just 6 years they've had to try it. If you look at the PA ministries, for example, there's far less corruption than there has ever been before. You can read the Palestinian budget on the internet. Fayyad has put it on the internet. For the first time, they have law and order in the sense that you can send your 10-year-old boy or girl out to buy milk at night without fearing some kind of incident, because there are police in the streets. There are traffic police. People get traffic tickets, the sure sign of civilization, right? So I think there's been really quite significant progress in the PA. The real problem, I would say, as I noted, is there hasn't been this kind of modernization of the Fatah party. People sometimes misstate what happened in the 2006 elections. Hamas won that election 44-41 in the popular vote. It's a pretty close election. I think they need to have another election, and I think they need to have it as soon as possible. I think this endless delay, where every 6 months they put off the elections, another 6 months, is a disaster. President Abbas, the president of the PA, is now serving a term which ended a couple of years ago. The terms of everybody in the parliament ended. Now, Abbas announced elections about a month ago. And then Hamas said, well, we're not having elections in Gaza. And Abbas said, well, if they're not going to have elections in Gaza, we're not going to have them in the West Bank. Huge mistake, it seems to me. Hold the elections. Let the people of the West Bank vote, and let the people of Gaza look there and blame Hamas for the failure to have an election there. So I think real progress is being made, and I think a lot more could be made. Just one other point on that. A couple of things that Netanyahu has done have been very good for the economy. For example, permitting Israeli Arabs to shop in large numbers in the West Bank. They're richer than Palestinian West Bank Arabs. So this is a huge shot in the arm for the Palestinian economy. Removal of a good number of roadblocks, checkpoints, so there's a good deal more. You can get a cab now in Ramallah and tell the driver, take me to Nablus, and take you there. So there is progress. I just think there could be a lot more of it.
I am wondering about the role of women. With the exception of Tunisia, it seems to me that the Arab world has not yet given women full participation, and I you mentioned before something about the Arab world will be the intellectual center for Muslims. What about Indonesia? What about Africa? I'm acquainted with a woman from Nairobi who is a stunningly bright, gifted peacemaker. And she's far more impressive than people that I have met that have spend their lives wearing veils. Is there some possibility that Muslims could prosper more from things they can learn from Africans and Indonesians than from Arabs?
There's no question that the heart of Arab democracy today is in Asia. You mentioned Indonesia, that's right. Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh. These are the countries that first proved that there was no contradiction between Islam and democracy by becoming democracies. And the role of women, I mean, Bangladesh has had women prime ministers. There's no question that well, I shouldn't say they will have to face up to this problem. Tunisia is probably the most advanced, but there are other examples. Several years ago, the King of Morocco put in place a family law code called the Mudawana, which gave women far more rights than they had previously had. Egypt has not been the worst of these. I mean, the Gulf countries are the worst. And even there, it's a mixed picture. The ambassador of Bahrain to the United States, it's almost unbelievable, but it's true, is a Jewish woman from a Bahraini Jewish family. They have to come to grips with this, and it's going to be a fight because there will be many religious authorities who oppose the role of women in public life, even in Egypt, never mind Saudi Arabia. And there'll be some women, too. You know, the public opinion polls show that it's not a case where 100% of the men and 0% of the women think that women should stay veiled and stay home. A substantial portion of women do. But part of the answer to this, I think, is to attack it, you might say, from the side. Education. One of the shocking numbers about the Middle East is is the illiteracy rates in so many countries, and they're always infinitely higher among women than among men. So if you can expand at least elementary education to make sure that everyone is is at least learning to read and write, I think that's a beginning. But this is going to be part of the debate with the religious authorities, with the debate in Egypt. They're going to have it. They're even beginning to have it already in just a matter of weeks. What is the role of Islam with respect to the state? What is the role of Islam with respect to women? I'm pretty optimistic about this. I really think you're going to see an expansion. It's almost impossible to think of the role of women contracting now in Egypt. I think, I was going to say, it's impossible to think of it contracting in Saudi Arabia because it couldn't be any narrower, but there they have to have the great historic debate about whether women can drive. But in the rest, I think you'll see, particularly in Egypt, I think that there'll be real progress.
If I understood you correctly, you made the statement earlier on that Israel had pretty much given up on the Zionist designs on the entire West Bank. That would appear to be at odds with developments in recent years and even in recent days, wherein construction of Israeli developments continue in and around the city of Jerusalem, and also the announcement, I believe, last week that Israel wants to retain control of the Jordan River Valley in order to provide security from Jordan, I assume, from the east. Comments on that?
Yeah. I do think that there is a vast, broad consensus in Israel now, which began to form really in 2002, that Palestinians should govern themselves in their own state, as Sharon was the first to put it. They should not be governed by Israelis, and they should not be in one state. There should not be a unitary state. For the Israelis, that is, from a demographic point of view, a mistake, a danger. So I think they've come to the conclusion, not 100% of Israelis, but 90% of Israelis, that they will need to make a deal with the Palestinians, and that roughly 95% of the West Bank will be the Palestinian state, and for the rest there will be land swaps. The Jordan River Valley, I think, is a different issue. As I've talked privately with Jordanians over the years, they are pretty satisfied having the Israeli Defense Force on the other side of the river. There's great cooperation between the Israeli and Jordanian armies. And if you think about it, when's the last time you read of an incident where a terrorist comes from Jordan, crosses the Jordan River, goes into Israel, and commits an act of terrorism? Doesn't happen because of the cooperation that keeps that a safe border. And the Jordanians, I think, pretty happy with that as a safe and stable border. And the Israelis are worried about what would happen if it became an unstable border. Ultimately, they're going to have to make a compromise on that as well. But most of the efforts to think about what a deal would look like have been over, let's say, a 10-year period where, if not more, for one thing, you've got tens of thousands of Israeli settlers who would have to move, and that can't happen overnight. So I think over time they'll resolve this question, but I think the question of the Jordan River and of Jordanian security, which this also involves, should not be understood to mean that the Israelis really want to keep all of the West Bank. I think that page has been turned.
Mr. Abrams, thank you for coming. I think the inevitable discussion that is coming out of all the events in the Middle East right now is whether or not this is somehow an overflow from U.S. efforts to promote democracy in Iraq. I was, wondering if you could comment on how that may fit into the Israel-Palestine question, and secondly, if you think that U.S. efforts have had an effect on promoting democracy across the Arab world, what indicators could you point to that show that this is a fact, from us as opposed to simply Arab self-determination?
First, I don't think this is much related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not a cause. This is happening within the Arab states, and it's been striking as we see people in the streets of Tunis or in the streets of Cairo. For one thing, they're not burning American flags, which is very interesting. We're not part of this. But they're not saying much about the Israeli-Palestinian issue either. Tunisians want to talk about Tunisia, and Egyptians want to talk about Egypt. Bahrainis want to talk about the future of Bahrain. Now, did we contribute to this? I think we contributed. What I can't do is measure it. There's no thermometer that tells me what percentage of it is us. But if you go back to 2002, there was a terrific document called the Arab Human Development Report. It was put out by the UN Development Program, completely written by a bunch of Arab intellectuals, and it was all about freedom. And it showed that the Arab world was way behind the rest of the world, however you measured it, literacy rates, computer usage, all of this, translation of books into Arabic from all the languages of the world. Greece, population 11 million, was translating more books than the 280 million people of the Arab world. And what was the problem and what was the answer? Said the Arab Human Development Report, freedom. They were the ones who coined the phrase democracy deficit. Also, we're getting in 2002 and 2003, the United States, President Bush, saying basically the same thing. Freedom is a central part of the rebirth of the Arab world. The problem in the Arab world is a lack of freedom, and it is not inevitable, and it has to change. He used to talk about Iraq. He used to talk about Palestine. He used to talk about Lebanon. And I think Iraq matters. Iraq is an important country in the Arab world, second only probably to Egypt. If and when Iraq becomes a stable democracy, I would say it's a democracy now, but not stable. If it becomes a stable democracy, and Egypt does, then the most weighty countries, in the case of Egypt, the most populous, and in the case of Iraq, with the growing oil revenue, a populous and soon-to-be rich country, will really put all of the weight in the Arab world on the democratic side. I think that has a huge impact. And among other things, it has a huge impact on Iran, because Iraq is a Shia majority state. So if next to Iran you've got a Shia democracy in Iraq, I think that really strengthens the Green movement and will lead a lot of Iranians to wonder, why can't we have that?
Welcome, Mr. Abrams.
Thank you.
So the United States uses foreign aid to protect our strategic interests, but it's embarrassing to find sometimes that we enable a lot of autocratic regimes. And I wondered if it wouldn't be more in our strategic interest to pay down our crippling national debt.
I think that we should not eliminate the foreign aid program. Some of it is straight humanitarian. For example, the President announced, I think it was yesterday, that we're sending teams to help the refugees from Libya who are on the border with Egypt, just across into Egypt. I think that's a good thing. I think we should do that. I think we are, even with the debt, a rich enough country so that we should be helping feed those people, house them, clothe them, while they are refugees and until things settle down and they can go home. We're doing it through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and CARE and so forth. I do think that we need to review the foreign aid program because sometimes I think it has not been conducive to, for one thing, to economic growth. And one of the things we should be trying to do with the program is not keep it going forever, but to get people in a situation like Korea, for example, where for a long time they got aid from us after the Korean War. Then they got an economy going. They got reasonably rich. Of course, the foreign aid to Korea stopped. In the case of Egypt, it's a tough one because most of the aid is military aid. Too much of the aid is military aid. The late Tom Lantos, the congressman from California who is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, shortly before his death, asked in a hearing about this, do you think that Egypt needs more tanks or more schools? And I think we can all agree on the answer to that. On the other hand, you know, the aid to the Army buys us influence with the Army. If we want them, for example, don't go into Tahrir Square and crush this demonstration with tanks. The fact that behind that there's $1 billion in military aid is obviously going to capture their attention. So what I would say, just to close on that, a few years ago we invented a thing called the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It is a piece of the foreign aid program. And what it does is not part of AID, it's separate. And what it does is look at the question of economic policy and freedom and good governance, effective governance in the recipient countries before it makes a grant. And it will rescind the grant. If you get a grant and then you close down all the newspapers, that's it. We should do more of that, it seems to me, than what we're doing through AID. I'd like to see a bit of a shift toward more, what I would consider to be a more effective foreign aid program.
Hello, Mr. Abrams. You mentioned that you thought that the Israelis and Palestinians could only really coexist separately.
Yes.
So I was just wondering what you thought the relationship would be between the two states if a successful Palestinian state were created. And also, do you think if that state were created, it would help relations between Israel and other Arab countries?
Well, the latter point, for sure. If there were a Palestinian state and it, like Jordan and Egypt, had formal relations with Israel, I think you'd see Israel enter into relations with most of the Arab states. I mean, this was offered in the Saudi plan in 2002. And after Camp David, Israel actually had not embassies, but had trade offices in a number of Arab states in North Africa and in the Persian Gulf. So I think relations would very much improve. I think relations between the state of Israel and the state of Palestine would be pretty good pretty quickly. For one thing, there are a lot of issues to cooperate on. The use of Ben Gurion Airport is one. The use of Ashkelon, Ashdod, other Israeli ports by the Palestinian state is another. Or some kind of joint use of, if you go south, Aqaba, Eilat. There's a lot of common interests. The border, the Jordan River, the Allenby Bridge. how's that going to work? Jordan, Israel, Palestine. So there's no Garden of Eden around the corner here. And I think there's not going to be a return to the sort of post-Camp David period when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians worked in Israel every day and traveled to Israel every day, and thousands and thousands of Israelis went to the West Bank. I think that'll be a long time in coming because of the terrible memories of terrorism. But I think formal relations will be good.
So a high percentage of Palestinians are quite young, under 25, I believe. I don't quite know the number, but many of them are in school. Are these schools like what we might call Western schools? Are they madrasas? Are there some combination of the two? What are these kids learning? That is, what sort of group is rising up to take, let us say, management roles in Palestine? Are they in the universities there? And what are they teaching? And what's your view of this very high number of people? What's going to happen to them when they get into the economy? What sort of economy are they going to be able to get into, or none at all?
The education picture is, I think, a mixed picture. There are no madrasas, as we usually use that term when we think about, say, Pakistan, that kind of school run by a religious order where basically all you're doing is memorizing the Quran. And you're away from home. Those madrasas are very often kind of boarding school. There are different school systems. For example, first of all, you have to separate Gaza, where the school system, the public school system, is under the control of Hamas. And I don't know what the curriculum is. I'm willing to bet some money that it's not one you and I would approve for Charlottesville. Then there are two other systems. There's the West Bank Public, and there's the UNRWA system, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the one that works for Palestinian refugees 60 years after the end of World War II and the creation of Israel. Mixed picture. The Palestinians keep reforming their textbooks. There's no question they are better in 2011 than they were in 2001, let's say, or 2005. And yet, I mean, you still get Palestinian textbooks in use. There is no state of Israel. There's just Palestine. And they talk about Haifa and Tel Aviv as Palestinian cities. So that's not what you might call education for peace. They're making slow progress, and they need to make more to raise a generation that's committed to coexistence. Then there's the other problem that you mentioned, which is the economy. Are they training people to be ready for the modern economy? Again, it's a mixed picture. There are a lot of Palestinians who are completely modern in the sense that they are part of the computer and cell phone world. A lot of cell phones in the West Bank. There are computer academies, if you will, where there are universities. That was the other question. There are several universities that are attempting to educate people in modern professions. But they do have the problem that you've got all over the Arab world, which is the number of people joining the labor market each year is greater than the number of new jobs each year. Of course, we have that problem recently too, but they have it much worse. And this is the reference I made before to Egypt with a population of 80 million. How are you going to create enough jobs for people who think, now life is going to be different now that we got rid of Mubarak, particularly when in Egypt the tourist economy is for the moment largely dead. And foreign investment, of course, is not going to come for a while because people want to see it calm down. There is more investment in the West Bank, but there is something missing here. It's not us, and it's not Europe, because the two greatest donors to the West Bank are the United States and the countries of Western Europe. It's the Arabs. You will have noticed that gas prices went up. Every time that happens, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis are taking in billions of dollars more that they did not expect and that are not in their budgets. I mean, this is true surplus. They are incredibly stingy when it comes to giving money to the Palestinians. They've all made pledges, and the pledges they made were made when oil was at something like $35 a barrel. So we go around begging, and we go around the Palestinians do, and they ask us for help. Can you get so-and-so? Can you raise it? The king of such and such is going to be in Washington. Can you raise with him, giving more money to the Palestinians? It's actually a scandal, because we get more speeches than we get help from most of the Arab oil producers when it comes to this work of building a Palestinian state.
Mr. Abrams, there are a lot of scandals all over. The word madrasa, for example, is the Arabic word for school. Any school doesn't have to be a religious school, just as a point. Another point is the Intifada took place, the first Intifada took place in the mid to late 80s, and it was very successful. The third item is the Oslo Accord, with the signing and the handshakes on the White House lawn, promised a Palestinian state in 5 years. And it was after the 5 years when nothing happened, and instead more and more and more settlements were built on the West Bank for Israelis that soured the majority of the Palestinian population to object to any agreement with Israel. And the third and last item is, how do you explain Israel's foreign minister who is preaching not only the expulsion of the Palestinians from the West Bank, but also the expulsion of the Israeli Arabs from Israel?
First, on the question of Oslo and disappointment about Oslo, we can debate that, but that cannot be an excuse for terrorism. I have seen too many statements from the UN that condemn, on the one hand, Israeli settlement activity, and on the other hand, equally, Palestinian terrorist activity. Building a house is not the moral equivalent of blowing up a Passover Seder or a discotheque full of teenagers or a restaurant full of diners. So the moral equivalency, I fully reject. Lieberman, the Israeli foreign minister, I may be wrong, but I do not believe that he has ever spoken about expelling Palestinians from the West Bank. Lieberman does believe in the two-state solution. He has talked about redrawing the border so that the Israeli Arabs in what's called the Triangle area, which is a very heavy area of Arab cities and towns, would become part of Palestine, would not be part of Israel. They wouldn't move, the border would move. Before you say it's a crazy idea, I would just say Henry Kissinger has written about this idea, among others. It's something that's going to have to be negotiated. What Palestinians want is a very interesting question. I saw a poll in the last 3 months about Jerusalemites, asking Jerusalem Arabs, what would you do if there's peace tomorrow? There's a Palestinian state and there's Israel, and they share Jerusalem in some way. And you, because you live in Jerusalem, you need to make a choice. What passport are you going to have? Right down the middle, split right down the middle. So the question of citizenship in the Palestinian state for at least for Jerusalemites is a difficult question. Many, I suspect, would like to have the dual passports. But we may disagree on some of this, but I do not think that any objection to the pace of change or of diplomatic reform can be used as an excuse for terrorism.
Mr. Abrams, in the United States government and the Israel lobby and AIPAC's main goal over the last 30 to 40 years has really been to push for support of Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to me, it seems at times when it is in Israel's geostrategic interest to have peace or to push the peace process, all of a sudden the Israel lobby and AIPAC's discourse changes to a demonization of Iran, some of which you've kind of noted on in your talk. And I'm wondering, A, if there was peace, if there was a settlement between the Arabs and Israelis and perhaps resulting in a Palestinian state, would that violate the efficacy and saliency that the Israel lobby might have in the United States government? And secondly, is there a place to incorporate Iran into a larger peace process in the Middle East? Because we've talked a lot about the Arab world, but is it important also to incorporate the Persian world into that larger peace process?
Well, I think I don't think we need to demonize the regime in Tehran. I think it demonizes itself, shooting demonstrators down in the street, stealing that election, violating all sorts of IAEA Board of Governors and other resolutions with respect to building a nuclear weapon. And also, it's the only case on record now of a government that's a member of the UN stating that it would like to destroy, it would like to eliminate, wipe off the map another government country that is a member of the UN. I mean, that's the position of the president of Iran. So I think they demonize themselves. Given that position, stated official position of Iran, I don't think they can be part of any peace process. They're not for peace. They're for eliminating the state of Israel. I think the Israelis would be completely crazy to agree to a negotiation where Iran was at the table, given that goal on their part. I think the striking thing about the Israel lobby today is that it consists by very far mostly of Christians. If you compare the support in the United States for Israel with the general lack of support in Europe, I think the difference is Christianity, which is largely gone in Europe. I mean, Europe is a continent full of empty churches that seem to be populated mostly with American tourists. But that is, of course, not true here, where there's such a vibrant Christian life. I've been told this story just very recently about a meeting of new members of Congress this year, where there was a conversation about exactly how much do we cut out of the budget. And one of the new members from a district which does not have a single Jew in it said, I am for cutting all of that out of the budget, but I don't want to take it out of the aid to Israel because I think they need it until there's peace. That's a very widespread view. And it isn't fundamentally AIPAC, because the thing is, AIPAC would not reverberate. AIPAC would not have the influence it does if a member of Congress who has a district that's 1% Jewish or 2% Jewish or 0% Jewish didn't know that in his own district he was getting letters, or her district, getting letters from Christians, from churches saying, our church just went to Israel last month and we want to hear what your position is. If there were peace, I imagine that the organizations like AIPAC would diminish greatly in size. I think they grew in size after 67, 73, when Israel's very existence seemed to be pretty much in doubt.
Mr. Abrams, thank you for your thoughtful comments. I want to think for a minute about the role of the U.S. specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It seems to me that one of your major points is to discount the value of table talk and conferences, and to elevate what we might call nation building. And I have two points about that. One is, are they necessarily contradictory, or are they necessarily a zero-sum game? You spend one and you don't spend the other. The other is, and my speculation there is that perhaps continued action on the conference front may help in Palestinian nation building. I'm interested in your comments on that. But secondly, specifically, what can the U.S. do? You mentioned aid, but what are 2 or 3 things that we should be doing in Palestine to assist in nation building? We haven't been very good at that, I don't think. And I'm wondering what you see as our role there, both in terms of conferences and in terms of nation building.
Thank you. I should say thank you to all the previous questioners as well for all of the questions. Well, you're right, substantially. I wouldn't say 100% on the sure. Why would it be that you can't do the state building and also the negotiations? There is a tension there. And one of the reasons there is that we have to figure out what we use our influence for with the Israelis. For example, I remember a number of times when there'd be a session coming between the Palestinian president or prime minister and the Israeli prime minister. And there'd be a negotiating session. We would want that negotiation to be a success. So we would say to the Israelis, well, that's an important diplomatic moment. So you have to do something for the Palestinian to help him out, and so he can show the Palestinian people that negotiation is a good negotiation, it's helpful. Let 500 prisoners out or something like that. Do something for the negotiation. When, in my view, instead, we should have been taking a far longer view and saying, never mind the reaction to Saturday's negotiation. What are you, in this case, you, the Israelis, what are you doing to help the Palestinian economy expand? I think instead of saying, let 500 prisoners out so President Abbas looks good on Saturday, if we said, there are 2 checkpoints that we want you to take away because we think they significantly interfere with mobility, which is very important economically in the West Bank, I think we would have been more likely to get it. So there is something of a tension as to what exactly are you asking the Israelis to do? What concessions are you asking them to make at any given moment? At one level. At another level, I think there is no fundamental tension because ultimately you're going to have a negotiation. And because you do want to foster, among other things, good personal relations at the top. You want the Israeli defense minister, the Israeli foreign minister, the Israeli prime minister, the Palestinian president, the Palestinian prime minister, to know each other and talk to each other and be able to solve problems. You want them to be able to call one another and say, we have a problem and I need you to act in the next hour and we can avoid a much larger problem. That happens sometimes, and the more it happens, of course, the more you can oil the machinery, the better. So I think one does not have to choose one or the other, but I think one has to choose which one favors, or to use a horrible, horrible word that I hate, privileges, which should be, in my view, a noun, not a verb, which one gives more emphasis to. And there I really do think it's the real world, because fundamentally, what happens in the real world, and I'll just close with this, what happens in the real world on the West Bank doesn't depend on what happens at the negotiating table. What happens at the negotiating table depends on the real world on the ground in the West Bank. And I think we always got to keep that in mind. And then, when we get to the negotiating table, we'll have a lot greater success. Thank you all very much.